So I have this beautiful little flower arrangement that I got for 4th of July. And then I was going through my old papers and I found this partially completed painting that I was just going to throw away, and then I realized that there was a portion of it I quite liked and might go nicely with this flower arrangement. So I have previously masked the daisies. So I have two different kinds of daisies. I have Shasta daisies and regular daisies. So I've masked those off with Pebeo drawing gum, and I have lifted a little bit of whites back into the background so that my foreground will overlap a little bit with the background. And now I want to work it wet into wet because I want to have a whole bunch of soft edges to start with. So in order to create soft distance, I want to start with just water. Now I'm applying some yellow paint for the centers of the daisies. I always like to start with yellow because yellow is easily polluted and influenced by other colors. So I'm using the sort of warm yellow, which in my palette is New Gamboge. And now I'm bringing in some Purell red to hint at the red flowers that are part of my flower arrangement. And the red flowers are, I always forget the name of the red flowers, but they look like little petunias, and someday I'm going to learn the actual name of them. So I'm just putting down areas of color. I like to do this when I do floral, is first get the areas of the colors of the flowers, and I'm going to skip the greens until a little later because there's a lot of green in a flower arrangement, but I don't like to put that in at first because it'll dull the other colors, especially anything that hints at red, because red and green are complementary colors, and they will just turn brown or gray if I mix them too much. So I've got the yellows in the centers of the daisies, and now I've hinted at the red flowers. So the whole arrangement is very patriotic for America. It's red, white, and blue. So here's my red. I've masked off the whites, as I said, and I'm going to start to bring in the blue. So for the beginning, I'm using a very warm blue, which is ultramarine blue, or ultramarine light by Holbein is my favorite of the ultramarines. And now I'm just sort of dropping in Cobalt Blue Violet by Daniel Smith, just to get a sense of these Veronica flowers that are long and slim. They kind of work like slow motion fireworks. They start to bloom from the bottom, and then they gradually bloom out to the tips. So the tips are actually still green. They're just dark. So I'm just, like I said, I started with Ultramarine Light by Holbein, and now I'm bringing in Cobalt Blue Violet, which is a Daniel Smith color of mine. And for the red, I use mostly Purell red, but I did bring in a little bit of cool red as well. Now the distant red is a different flower. Looks a little like Joshua's beard. And so I've kept that quite a bit less in value. Now you can see I'm bringing in the green. So my base green is usually a green called Cascade Green. It's a Daniel Smith color. The green itself is a combination of raw sienna and phthalo blue. And I can skew it either way, either to the warm side or to the cool side by adding either blue or yellow to the mix. So you can see I'm trying to stay really far away from the red with the green because I don't want my reds to turn brown or gray by mixing complements. And at this point you can't even tell where my daisies are. They're just kind of a medium gray. I use Pebeo drawing gum for my masking. I've been pretty happy with it. It goes on nice and inky and then dries to medium gray. So I have a good gray reference, or value reference when I'm painting all the time. I find the masking fluid that dries yellow tends to skew my color perception. So I really like the medium gray quality of the Pebeo drawing gum. So I'm putting more red in. Again, I'm trying to keep those greens far away from the reds. And I like to break out of the box. You can see that I have a white edge all around this. I like to bring some of the things to break out of that little box. When I'm done, I'll probably rip the other side to match so there's white border all around, but I'll leave the red and the blue Veronica to burst outside that little white edge box. I'm pulling up my palette knife here. Sometimes if you use a scrapey tool, like with a hard edge, you can get the sense of a line. So the paint will flow down into the crevice in the paper that you're creating and create kind of a dark line and I like to scribble that. Now again, when it's wet, the paint will fall down into that crevice that you're creating with the hard surface. So I just used a little diamond-shaped palette knife to create some line effects in there, just to create some texture ideas. Now I'm picking up my green. I'm going to do some calligraphy strokes to pull in some foliage leaves, very much like the Asian painters do. Oh, and you got to have splatters. I like to splatter at the early stages when it's wet so that it softens into the back but creates some edges. I like to pound on the centers with the back of my brush. So again, it creates a crevice in the paper and the paint falls into there. This gives me a little textures in those centers. Getting some dark greens underneath that masking, because I really want, when I take the masking off, I want to have those white petals really pop so that it'll have red, white, and blue. For my Americans painting. All right, here goes the calligraphy strokes. So the way you do this is you get up onto the tip, a 90-degree angle on your brush, and then you try to keep your wrist stiff and then press in the middle of the stroke. So you start out on the tip and pull, and then press down as you pull. So here we go. If I do this when it's wet, then those will leave nice soft edges. I might bring in some more once it's dry, but for now I just want really soft strokes. So I'm using a round brush, number 14 by Low Cornell. Has a very nice point, but it's a synthetic brush, so the bristles are a little bit stiffer than you would get with a Asian calligraphy brush typically, but it makes a nice leaf effect. Now you'll see that there is a picture of the still life in the corner of your painting, so you can see what I'm painting as I go. I really do need to look up the name of those little petunia flowers. They just look like miniature petunias. Starts with a CH. Now I'm just dotting in some values, so I still have damp paper. It's not super wet anymore, but it's damp. So I'm going to get a slightly different edge. So you can have lost edges, soft edges, and hard edges. So if I paint when it's super wet into wet, I get a lost edge. But when I paint when it's damp, I get a soft edge. So I like to carve out those yellow flowers by painting around them, typically called negative painting. And again, I want to get some real darks around the edges so that I pop out the edges of those red flowers, the little petunias. And again, really painting dark around the white so that those white petals will really pop once I pull off the masking. And finding the petunia flowers by painting around them with the cobalt blue violet again. Now I'd like to lift off the middles of the flowers because the middles are kind of a yellow tone around and surrounded by the red petals. So I'm just lifting gently off the centers of the petals there. So once I lift the paint, then I want to wipe it off on my dabbing cloth so that I don't put that red paint I just lifted right back into the painting. Okay, calling out the edges again. I'm going to let it sit for just a minute, and then I'm going to touch in a little bit of yellow into those centers. I do want to pump up the reds in the stripes of the American flag, just so that that's kind of a, it's in the background, but it's a little too faded. I want to make sure that it's part of the painting. Again, this is damp back here, so I'm just dotting in some color of this Joshua's beard-like flower in the back. They're really tiny little red flowers, and they're kind of cradled. Look a little bit like Queen Anne's lace, except they're red. They have very thin stems and foliage. I'll do most of the work once the paint or the paper is dry. Pump up the volume a bit on my Veronica with my cobalt blue violet primarily, but I'm mixing in some of the ultramarine blue as well. Again, I lifted a little bit more in the centers of those flowers. Just go back. I just want to get a hint of the centers being different, but nice soft edges. Back again, pumping up the volume on the Veronica with my cobalt blue violet. It's a really beautiful dark blue violet. Perfect color for painting Veronica flowers. Once again, I want to carve out some of the reds, the edges of the petals while it's still fairly damp, so I can get a soft edge with that. And now I think I'll probably let it dry. I came back. Now the paper is dry, and I've pulled off my masking. You can see now that the white daisy petals really pop because I put the darks around there. So I'm using a piece of masking tape to pull off the remaining masking fluid. I also splatter masked a little bit into the Veronica plant, so I should get white sparkles. I'm just using masking tape, making sure every time I pull I get a clean piece and area of the masking, and I just get some sparkles on that Veronica plant. And also in the Joshua's beard type flower in the distance. So how I did that was I splatter masked some of that really inky Pabio drawing gum. Really want to make sure I get all the masking off the petals. So I have two different kinds of daisies. I have two Shasta daisies, which have long and thin petals, and then a regular daisy. Okay, you have to wait until the paper is really dry in order to do this masking pull off. Okay, now I'm going to paint wet onto dry, and this is going to give me hard edges. I'm just going to hint at, bring out more of the centers, give it some volume and mass. So I'm painting with the warm yellow around the edge a little bit, getting a sense of where the light is coming from, painting the shadow side. And just want to get some texture. So I'm using the green. I like to put in yellow flower centers, I like to put just a hint of green in the middle of the flower. If you look really close, there's always just a tiny bit of a green, yellow, very yellow green in the middle of yellow flower centers. Now I want to get a sense of volume, so I'm going to paint kind of a grayed down blue in between. I'm going to paint in between the flower petals. Get some shadow, so it's not just white. Give these a sense of shadow and light. Maybe soften some edges, so gently scrub. It looks like I'm pushing really hard, but I'm actually just gently scrubbing just to soften a few of those hard edges. That's the disadvantage of using masking, is all the edges will dry really hard. So I want to have a combination of edges. That cobalt blue violet lifts a little easier than some other paints, the Purell red stains. So I'm lifting in the cobalt blue violet, then I'm going to bring some of that in, that same color, kind of in, and find some edges of different petals. Remember, they all grow from the center. As you can see in the picture, I'm not really following what I'm actually seeing. I'm just kind of using my still life as a place to give me inspiration. I'm not following it slavishly. Okay, working up onto the second daisy, using some green to sort of clean up that white edge that was created. I want to make sure I get a variety of shape in my daisies so that everything doesn't look exactly the same. So this one is a little bit different orientation. We see more of a side view, not quite as much to the center, and it's much more elliptical rather than round, almost a triangular shape. Same thing with the distant one. We see a little bit more of the center. It's not quite as of a side view. So again, I'm just giving a little texture and green bits to the centers of those little flowers, and then orange colors around the edges. I love to put that little green center in there. Makes it come alive to me. I'm going to use some of the manganese blue. I haven't used much of that in these distant because it's a cooler blue. It'll feel like it's further back. It helps that third daisy recede. But if I use it up there, I got to use it in the foreground too. Otherwise, it'll look disjointed and I won't have unity, overall unity in my painting. While I was waiting for it to dry, I did a lot of looking at my painting. You have to remember to stare at your painting and find out, because when you're really close to it, you don't see what you're doing necessarily. You don't see the whole picture. So I like to stare at it quite a bit during different stages. Look at it in a different way as well. Put it in front of a mirror, or I have a projection system. I look at it up on the wall, projected, look at it upside down. Just mix it up so your brain sees it in a different way. So I'm using red now to call, because behind this is the red. So I'm using the red to call out the flowers, because there's a red flower behind. One thing you want to make sure you don't do is just outline it all exactly the same all the way around the flower. So at one point I have green, then I have a little blue violet, then I have a little red. So it doesn't look like it's chopped out and cut and pasted onto there. It looks like it's part of the scene. Now I'm putting in the yellow in the centers of those flowers. So I waited until it was nice and dry, and I just want a hint of yellow tone in the middle of those centers. I don't want to cover up the entire area. I just want to pop in a little bit of yellow in the middle of those red petunia-like flowers. Find a little bit of the separation of those petals with the red. They do have a little striations in between petals, but they feel like a little bell. They're all connected, but there are individual petals. I'm just trying to hint at that when it's dry. And I'm using the cool, sometimes the cool red, which in my case is quinacridone rose, as well as the Pierrot red. When it comes into the light, I'm tending to have warm light, cool shadow in this painting. So I'm bringing out my smaller brush now, pulling in my blue and my red violet, and my blue violet, maybe a little more red. I think the Veronica are a little too one-colory, so I want to bring in some red violets as well. Oh, sorry, blue violet for the flag around there. I did use wax to save the whites in the flag, so I can't really adjust that unless I heat it off. But I do want the flag to be just a little more apparent, because it's kind of a important element in the whole painting. That's the only thing I'm going to do to the background that I found conveniently in my closet. So I'm using a little bit of green. I want to make sure I overlap this shape here, so it gives a sense of this flower being in front of the background. And again, I'm putting in some more darks, more red violet tones, trying not to cover up my splatter whites, because that's what gives it the sparkle. And I really want to darken the bottom edge of this Veronica, just to give it some dark value contrast. Painting in between the foliage plants that I created, and just working some darks in between the flowers now that I know where the petals are in the white. I love how the white flowers are popped out. It would be really hard to save that by painting around. I'm just going to use some little calligraphy strokes. I almost always end my paintings with some little calligraphy strokes, and I like to use a rigger brush for this. My rigger brush is a long, narrow hairs. There's not very many of them, but they're long and narrow, and they give you a really nice line. So I'm just going to do some random line strokes with my rigger brush. Going to make it more of a drawing effect. Draw in some of those stringy leaf and stem shapes that, and now the paint is dry, or the paper is dry, I can keep a hard edge. I don't like it to be too stiff. So I want to kind of build up the little cradle below. Got to have a little bit more oomph on my paint and do some of the calligraphy stroke leaves. Now that it's dry, they'll stay more apparent. It's the same stroke as I did before, but I just want to have a variety of value. Some yellow green, some dark green, and now I want to paint a little bit of foliage underneath that red distant, very tiny little flowers, but just a whole bunch of them, just to give a little bit of shape to that distant flower. Trying really hard to avoid all my white sparkles to give it a sense of sparkle and light being outside. Just knocked back a few of those calligraphy strokes, but now I'm going to do some more with my rigger, with the blue, and just kind of scribble a little bit. I like to use it very vertical. You can see my hand is there, the brush handle is almost completely perpendicular to the paper. It gives me a real thin line. Just hint at some really tiny line shapes. There's the center of the Veronica stem, where the flowers all come off the stem. And again, the tips of the flowers are fairly green, so they haven't blossomed yet. Get some of that cascade green. Get some little definition in the stems and leaves, the bottom of that blossom cradle. And working wet with a wet brush onto dry paper gives me a hard edge. And just a fun little painting that I found in my closet where half of the work was already done. I didn't have the first part of that painting on video, but this makes it even more interesting. I'm going to give it a signature with my rigger brush. I like to use a color that I've used in the painting, in this case the red. I'll use the red. And I generally don't sign it until I'm sure I'm done, and I'm probably going to work on this some more after I stare at it a bit. So I did stare at the painting for quite a while, several days in fact, and the only thing that really bothered me about it was the stem was coming down here. I had the two stems, and then it looked like the stem stopped the red flower. So the only thing I did was brought a little bit of red onto this side of the stem, and then I tried to give a sense of moving that stem over a little bit, the stem for this Veronica, or either the Veronica or for that daisy. And then I did go ahead and rip the outer edge. So on this side, the white edge is a little wider. I have the sense though that it's a little more symmetrical. So I have a ripped edge here. I call this the Reynolds rip, where I have a straight edge and then show the decal of the paper. And then around here, this was the original edge of the paper, and where I had taped it, I like that irregular edge. And down here I do as well, so that it looks like the Veronica is coming outside the box. And so I like the effect overall. The only other thing I wanted to do was erase some of the pencil marks that came out into the white. So I'm going to do that now and maybe see if I can erase. Once you paint over pencil lines, they're pretty hard to erase back, but I think it's okay. I'll just not worry about it. Do the best I can and call it done. So, quite like my little Americans painting. I might change the title eventually, but right for now I'm calling it The Americans. And it's a fun little way to save a painting, piece of paper that I pretty much was going to throw away. Now I've made it into a sweet little painting with a patriotic theme. Thanks for joining me. I hope you enjoyed the process as much as I did painting it.